A peculiar, almost unnatural quiet often settled over the Vance farm in Culpeper County, Virginia, especially during the long, humid summers of the 1850s. It was a silence that seemed to absorb the chirping of crickets and the rustle of the wind through the tall corn, a stillness too profound for a household rumored to be teeming with children. For years, whispers had circulated through the dusty roads and general stores of the county seat. Questions had festered in the minds of neighbors, but no one dared to truly look beneath the surface of Harlan Vance's devout and prosperous facade. Until one sweltering August afternoon, when a traveling preacher invited for a simple meal heard something that would unravel a truth far more disturbing than any local gossip, a truth that had been buried quite literally for years. Before we continue with the story of the Vance family, if you find yourself drawn to tales of history's hidden horrors and the unsettling truths that lie beneath the surface of everyday life, please consider subscribing to Liturgy of Fear. Your support helps us unearth more stories like this one. Calpa County, Virginia in 1852 was a place of rolling hills, fertile tobacco fields, and a deeply ingrained sense of community. Life moved at the pace of the seasons dictated by the rhythms of planting and harvest. Families were often large, and children were a common sight, their laughter and shouts echoing across the fields. The county seat, also named Culpeper, was a small but bustling hub with a courthouse, a general store, a blacksmith, and a handful of churches, each serving as a pillar of the community's moral and social fabric. It was a place where reputations were built slowly and carefully, and where a family's standing was often measured by discover more, videos, sacks, their piety, their industry, and the size of their land holdings. The Vance farm, situated a good distance from the main roads, was one of the most prosperous in the region. Harlan Vance, the patriarch, had arrived in Calpa some 15 years prior. A man of stern demeanor and unyielding faith, he had purchased a substantial tract of land, cleared it with relentless effort, and built a sturdy farmhouse that stood as a testament to his ambition and hard work. His wife Dorcas was a quiet woman, rarely seen in town. Her presence at church services a fleeting glimpse of a figure always clad in modest dark dresses. The Vances were known for their strict adherence to their particular brand of Methodism, a faith that emphasized personal piety, hard work, and a deep suspicion of worldly pleasures. Harlan Vance was a man of contradictions. He was respected for his agricultural acumen, his fields yielding bountiful harvests year after year. He was known to be fair in his dealings, though distant. Yet there was an undeniable air of isolation about the Vance family. They kept to themselves, rarely participating in community gatherings beyond Sunday service, and even then they would arrive late and depart early. Harlan's gaze was often described as intense. His sermons at home, as overheard by the occasional passing peddler, were said to be fiery and long-winded, filled with pronouncements of sin and damnation for a world he perceived as increasingly corrupt. The community's unease began subtly, a slow-growing vine of suspicion. The Vances were known to have children, many children, or so it was believed. Yet these children were never seen. Not at the county fair, not at the infrequent schoolhouse gatherings, not even playing in the fields surrounding their own home. A neighbor, Mrs. Elara Finch, who lived a mile down the road, once remarked to her husband that she hadn't heard a child's voice from the Vance property in years. A strange observation given the size of their family. When asked about his offspring, Harlan would offer vague, dismissive answers, speaking of their delicate constitutions or their need for spiritual instruction that kept them from the corrupting influences of the outside world. Most people in that era of deference to a man's private domain simply nodded and accepted his explanations, however unsatisfying they might be. The Vances were peculiar, yes, but they were also prosperous and pious, and in Calpa County those qualities often outweighed quiet eccentricities. The silence, however, remained a heavy, unnatural silence that seemed to press down on the very earth around the Vance farm. The summer of 1852 was particularly oppressive, the air thick with humidity, the sun beating down relentlessly on the parched earth. It was into this sweltering landscape that Reverend Aldous Puett, a traveling Methodist minister, found himself on the road leading to the Vance farm. Puett was a man of God, but also a man of practicalities, accustomed to the hospitality of rural families during his circuit rides. He had heard of Harlan Vance's devout nature, and seeking a meal and a night's rest before continuing his journey, decided to call upon the prosperous farmer. Harlan Vance, surprisingly, received him. His welcome was not warm, but it was not outright hostile either. He seemed to view the minister as a necessary, if somewhat inconvenient, obligation. Puett was invited inside the farmhouse, a large, well-maintained structure that, despite its outward appearance of comfort, felt strangely cold and unwelcoming. The interior was sparsely furnished, meticulously clean and eerily quiet. There was no clutter, no signs of the lively chaos that usually accompanied a large family. Dorcas Vance, Harlan's wife, served a simple meal of stew and cornbread. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her eyes downcast, her face pale and drawn. Pwit, a man accustomed to reading people, noted her nervous energy, the way her hands trembled slightly as she placed the dishes on the table. He tried to engage her in conversation, asking about her day, about the children, but her responses were monosyllabic, her gaze darting nervously towards her husband, who sat at the head of the table observing them both with an unblinking intensity. As the meal progressed, a strange sound began to emanate from beneath the floorboards. It was faint at first, a soft scuffling like mice in the walls, but then it grew clearer. A muffled thud followed by what sounded unmistakably like a child's whimper, quickly stifled. Pruitt paused, his fork halfway to his mouth, his brow furrowed in confusion. He glanced at Harlan, who continued to eat, his expression unchanged as if he heard nothing out of the ordinary. But Dorcas Vance heard it. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with a sudden profound terror. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin ashen, almost translucent. A small, involuntary gasp escaped her lips, and her hand flew to her mouth as if to suppress a scream. Her gaze for a fleeting moment met Pryatt's, and in that instant he saw not just fear, but a deep, agonizing despair, a silent plea for understanding, for help. It was a look that would haunt him for weeks. Harlan, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere, cleared his throat loudly. "Just the old house settling, Reverend," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth, or perhaps a stray animal in the cellar. He then launched into a lengthy discourse on the corrupting influences of the outside world, the moral decay of society, and the importance of shielding the innocent from its grasp. Peewit, though disturbed, felt compelled to listen. His mind, however, still replaying the muffled sound, the stifled whimper, and Dorcas's tarry. "Feed eyes," he finished his meal quickly, his appetite gone. He politely declined Harlan's offer of a bed for the night, citing an urgent need to reach the next town. As he rode away from the Vance farm, the setting sun casting long, ominous shadows, the image of Dorcas's face etched with silent horror remained vivid in his mind. He knew with a chilling certainty that what he had heard was not the house settling, nor a stray animal. It was a child, and Dorcas Vance knew it too. The very next morning, Reverend Pruitt rode directly to the Culpeper County Sheriff's Office. He recounted his unsettling experience to Sheriff Nathaniel Halt, a man known for his quiet diligence and unwavering sense of duty. Pitt described the unnatural silence of the farm, the absence of children, Harlan's evasiveness, and most importantly, the muffled sounds from beneath the floorboards, and Dorcas Vance's profound, undeniable terror. Sheriff Hole listened intently, his expression growing graver with each detail. He had heard the whispers about the Vances, of course, but this was the first concrete eyewitness account that suggested something truly amiss. The seed of suspicion, long dormant in the community, had finally found fertile ground. The Vance family had arrived in Culpeper County in the mid-1830s, a decade and a half before Reverend Pruitt's unsettling visit. Harlan Vance, then a man in his late 20s, had purchased a substantial tract of land, far enough from the main settlements to afford him a degree of privacy, yet close enough to be considered part of the community. He was a man of formidable will, and his initial years were marked by relentless labor, transforming untamed wilderness into productive farmland. He brought with him a young wife, Dorcas, who was then barely out of her teens, and a reputation for strict piety. At first, the Vances were simply seen as hard work, king and devout, if a little reserved. They attended the local Methodist church, though Harlan often expressed his dissatisfaction with the minister's sermons, finding them insufficiently rigorous in their condemnation of sin. He soon began holding his own services on his farm, inviting no one, but his booming voice could sometimes be heard echoing across the fields on a Sunday morning. The first signs that something was truly amiss were subtle, easily dismissed by a community accustomed to respecting a man's dominion over his own household. Dorcas Vance, initially seen occasionally in town, grew increasingly reclusive. Her once bright eyes seemed to dim, and a perpetual shadow seemed to cling to her. When she did appear, she moved with a quiet urgency, avoiding eye contact, her demeanor that of a woman carrying an immense unspoken burden. Then came the children, or rather, the lack of them. The Vances were known to have had several births over the years, yet these children were never seen. Neighbors who tried to inquire were met with Harlan's stern pronouncements about their fragile health or their need for undisturbed spiritual development. Mrs. Elara Finch, a kind-hearted woman who had once offered to bring a pie to Dorcas after a difficult birth, was met at the door by Harlan, who curtly informed her that his wife and child were resting and required no visitors. The pie was left on the porch untouched. Over time, these small incidents accumulated, forming a pattern of isolation and secrecy. A young boy, Thomas Miller, who had once ventured too close to the Vance property while hunting squirrels, reported seeing a small, pale face peering from an upstairs window, only to be quickly pulled back. When he told his father, Mr. Miller, a pragmatic man, dismissed it as a trick of the light or the boy's imagination. Harlan Vance keeps to himself, son, he'd said, and the teats his right. Another instance involved a traveling peddler, a jovial man named Silas, who had stopped at the Vance farm hoping to sell some trinkets. He recalled hearing faint, rhythmic thudding sounds from beneath the house, like someone working with a shovel, even in the dead of night. When he mentioned it to Harlan, the farmer had simply glared at him, his eyes cold and unyielding, and told him to mind his own business. Silas, unnerved, quickly departed and never returned to the Vance property. These were the testimonies, the fleeting glimpses, the hushed whispers that had circulated through Culpa County for years. Each time they were met with a shrug, a dismissal, or a quiet fear of challenging Harlan Vance, a man whose piety was as formidable as his temper. The community, in its deference to privacy and its reluctance to interfere, had inadvertently allowed a shadow to deepen over the Vance farm. A shadow that now, with Reverend Puatit's report, threatened to engulf them all. The question was not just what was happening at the Vance farm, but how long it had been happening and why no one had truly acted sooner. Sheriff Nathaniel Holt was a man of quiet resolve, his mind methodical, his actions deliberate. Reverend Puat's account, though lacking concrete proof, had struck a chord of deep unease. The whispers, the evasiveness, Dorcas Vance's terror, it all coalesced into a disturbing picture that Holt could no longer ignore. He knew that confronting Harlan Vance without proper cause would be met with fierce resistance and potentially a legal battle that would drain county resources and public trust. He needed more than a preacher's intuition. He needed facts. Hole began his investigation discreetly. He started by reviewing county records. The Vance property was extensive. Its tax assessments always paid promptly. Birth records for the county were less precise in those days, but he found entries for several Vance children over the years. However, there were no records of their schooling, no baptisms beyond the first few, and certainly no deaths recorded. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist after their birth. This discrepancy gnawed at Holt. His next step was to speak with neighbors, but with a more pointed approach than casual gossip. He visited Mrs. Elara Finch again, who, emboldened by the sheriff's official inquiry, recounted her observations about the unnatural silence and Dorcas's withdrawn nature. He spoke to Thomas Miller's father, who, after some prodding, admitted that his son's story about the face in the window had always bothered him. Each conversation, though yielding no direct evidence, reinforced the pervasive sense of something deeply wrong. Hole then expanded his search, looking beyond Culper County. He began to examine records from neighboring counties, specifically looking for reports of missing children, particularly those from families who might have been transient or less connected to their communities. It was a long, arduous task, sifting through handwritten ledgers and faded newspaper notices. The sheer number of missing persons reports, even for children, was disheartening, a testament to the harsh realities of the era. It was during this painstaking process that he encountered Agnes Bellamy. Agnes was a woman from a small, struggling farmstead in an adjacent county, her face etched with years of worry and grief. She had been trying to find her son Samuel for 3 years. Samuel, then 7 years old, had vanished from their farm one afternoon while playing near the woods. The local sheriff had conducted a search, but Samuel had simply disappeared without a trace. Agnes, however, refused to give up. She had heard rumors of a prosperous farmer in Culpeper who sometimes hired young boys for odd jobs, paying them well, but always insisting on absolute discretion. She had never been able to pinpoint the farm, nor had she dared to venture far from her own meager home. Hole listened to Agnes's story, a cold dread settling in his stomach. The description of the prosperous farmer who sought discretion, combined with the Vance family's reclusiveness and the missing children from their own household, began to form a chilling hypothesis. He showed Agnes a rough sketch of Harlan Vance, drawn from memory by a local merchant. Agnes's eyes widened, and a faint tremor ran through her. "That's him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's the man I heard about." The pieces were beginning to fit, forming a mosaic of suspicion that was far more sinister than mere eccentricity. Hole knew he could no longer delay. He had enough circumstantial evidence, and now a grieving mother's desperate identification, to warrant a more direct approach. He would need a court order, a legal mandate to search the Vance property. He knew Harlan Vance would fight him every step of the way, but Sheriff Hole was a man who understood that sometimes the law had to push past the boundaries of polite society to uncover the truth. If you're finding this story as gripping as we are, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who appreciates a truly unsettling historical mystery. Your engagement helps us bring these forgotten tales to light. The air in Culpa County grew heavy, not just with the oppressive August heat, but with a palpable sense of anticipation. News of Sheriff Holt's investigation, though kept as quiet as possible, had begun to filter through the community. The whispers about the Vances intensified, no longer just idle gossip, but tinged with a growing fear. Sheriff Halt, armed with a carefully worded court order signed by Judge Elias Thorne, rode out to the Vance farm a week after his meeting with Agnes Bellamy. He did not go alone. He brought with him two deputies, young men named Thomas and Caleb, both seasoned enough to handle a potentially volatile situation. The sun beat down mercilessly, shimmering off the dusty road, and the only sound was the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the distant buzz of cicadas. As they approached the farm, the familiar, unnatural silence descended upon them. The fields were meticulously tended, the farmhouse stood stark and imposing against the sky. There was no sign of life, no children playing, no farmhands working in the midday sun. It was as if the entire property held its breath. Harland Vance met them at the front door, his face a mask of cold fury. He was a formidable figure, tall and broad-shouldered, his eyes narrowed into slits of suspicion. "Sheriff Halt," he boomed, his voice resonating with indignation. "To what do I owe this unwarranted intrusion?" Hole, maintaining a calm demeanor, presented the court order. "Mr. Vance, I have reason to believe there are matters on this property that require investigation. This warrant grants me permission to search your premises." Harland snatched the paper, his eyes scanning the document, his jaw clenching. "This is an outrage, a slanderous attack on a God-fearing man. My home is my sanctuary, my family, my private concern." He began to rail against the meddling of the state and the corruption of worldly authorities, his voice rising in volume and intensity. As Harland's tirade continued, Dorcas Vance appeared in the doorway behind him. She was even paler than Reverend Pewitwood had described, her eyes wide and hollow, fixed on the sheriff with a mixture of terror and a strange, desperate hope. She clutched a worn apron to her chest, her knuckles white. "Harlan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please." Harlan ignored her, his focus entirely on Holt. "You will find nothing here, Sheriff. Nothing but a family living in accordance with God's will." Hole, however, noticed Dorcas. He saw the tremor in her hands, the way her gaze flickered towards the ground beneath their feet. He saw the silent plea in her eyes, a plea that seemed to confirm every suspicion he had harbored. "Mr. Vance," Holt said, cutting through Harlan's bluster, "I am here to ensure the welfare of all individuals on this property. I must insist on a full search." Harland took a step forward, his face contorted in a snarl. "You will not set foot in my house without my express permission, Sheriff." It was at this moment that Dorcas Vance's composure finally shattered. A low guttural sob escaped her lips, and she crumpled to the floor, her body shaking uncontrollably. "No, Harland, please," she wailed, her voice raw with anguish. "No more. They'll find them. They'll find them all." Her words hung in the air, a chilling confirmation of the community's darkest fears. Harlan froze, his face draining of color, his defiant posture collapsing. He stared at his wife, then at Halt, a flicker of pure panic in his eyes. Hole moved swiftly. "Deputies, secure Mr. Vance. Mrs. Vance, where are they?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm, kneeling beside her. Dorcas, sobbing hysterically, pointed a trembling finger towards the floorboards in the entryway. Under the house, the cellar, the passage. Her words were broken, choked by tears, but the meaning was terrifyingly clear. The deputies quickly restrained Harlan, who for the first time seemed utterly defeated, his earlier bluster replaced by a stunned silence. Hole, his heart pounding, moved to the spot Dorcas had indicated. He knelt, examining the floorboards. They looked ordinary, well-maintained, indistinguishable from the rest of the house. But then he iced it, a faint, almost imperceptible seam in the wood, cleverly disguised, running along the edge of a wider plank. He pressed against it, and with a soft click, a section of the floorboard gave way, revealing a dark, narrow opening beneath. A cold, musty draft wafted up, carrying with it the faint, unmistakable scent of damp earth. And something else. Something human. The entrance to the hidden world beneath the Vance farm had been found. Sheriff Halt, his heart, a cold knot in his chest, peered into the darkness. The opening was not a simple cellar door, but a cleverly concealed hatch designed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding floorboards. He retrieved a lantern from the wagon, its flickering light pushing back the oppressive gloom. What he saw sent a shiver down his spine. Beneath the house, a narrow hand-dug tunnel descended steeply into the earth. The walls were shored up with rough-hewn timbers, clearly the result of years of painstaking labor. The air was thick with the smell of damp soil, stale air, and something else, something faintly metallic and organic, a smell that spoke of long confinement. "Deputies," Hole commanded, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Secure the perimeter, no one in, no one out, and keep a close watch on Mr. Vance." He then turned to Dorcas, who was still weeping on the floor, now being gently attended to by Deputy Caleb. "Mrs. Vance, how many are down there?" Dorcas could only shake her head, her sobs racking her body. "So many. Too many. Hole took a deep breath, steeling himself. He knew this was going to be worse than anything he had imagined. He lowered himself into the tunnel, the lantern casting dancing shadows on the earth and walls. The passage was cramped, forcing him to stoop, and the air grew heavier, warmer as he descended. He could hear nothing but the frantic beating of his own heart and the distant muffled sound of the world above. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a larger space. It was not a natural cave, but a series of interconnected rooms painstakingly excavated from the earth beneath the farmhouse. The walls were packed earth, reinforced with more timbers, and the ceiling was low, making the space feel claustrophobic and oppressive. The first room was dimly lit by a single flickering oil lamp, its wick nearly spent. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale food, and human waste. And then he saw them children. They were huddled together in various states of fear and confusion, their eyes wide and unblinking in the sudden glare of Holt's lantern. Some were curled into tight balls. Others stared blankly, their faces pale and gaunt. Their clothes were simple, homespun, and worn, many of them too large or too small, suggesting they had been passed down repeatedly. Their hair was matted, their skin grimy, and their bodies thin, almost skeletal. Hole counted them, his voice catching in his throat. 1, 2, 3, 1, 7 children, ranging in age from what appeared to be 4 or 5 years old, up to a boy who looked to be 16 or 17. They were silent, utterly silent. Not a single cry or whimper among them, only the soft, ragged sound of their breathing. It was the silence that was perhaps the most terrifying, a silence born not of peace but of profound ingrained fear. He moved slowly through the underground labyrinth, his lantern illuminating the grim reality of their existence. The rooms were crude but functional. There were makeshift beds, straw mattresses laid directly on the earthen floor, covered with thin threadbare blankets. A small crude table and a few stools occupied one corner, and in another a bucket served as a latrine. There were no toys, no books, no signs of childhood joy or learning, only the bare necessities for survival. And even though were meager. In one corner, he found a small, carefully constructed ventilation shaft leading up towards the surface, cleverly disguised among the roots of an old oak tree outside. This was how they breathed, how the air, however stale, circulated. This was how Harland Vance had kept his secret for so long. As Hole moved among the children, a young girl, no older than 6, slowly reached out a trembling hand towards him, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and anent curiosity. He knelt, offering a gentle, reassuring smile, but she recoiled, pulling her hand back as if burned. They were like wild animals, unaccustomed to human kindness, conditioned to fear. He found a small locked wooden chest in one of the rooms. Forcing it open, he discovered a collection of crude tools, shovels, picks, buckets, all covered in dried earth. This was the evidence of the years of labor, the relentless secret excavation that had created this subterranean prison. Hole emerged from the underground chambers hours later, his face grim, his uniform covered in dust and grime. The deputies had managed to calm Dorcas Vance, who was now sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket staring blankly ahead. Harland Vance was secured in the wagon, his head bowed, his earlier defiance completely gone, replaced by a chilling, almost serene resignation. 17 children. Hole announced to his deputies, his voice hoarse. 17. Some of them they looked like Vance's. Others, I don't know. The question of where the other children came from and why Harland Vance had gone to such extraordinary length to keep them underground and hidden from the world now became the dark core of this unfolding tragedy. The answer, when it finally came, would disturb an entire county and send reverberations through the Virginia legislature itself. For those who appreciate the meticulous reconstruction of historical events and the chill, linged implications of human nature, consider becoming a patron of Liturgy of Fear. Your support allows us to delve deeper into these forgotten archives and bring you more untold stories. The discovery of the 17 children sent a shockwave through Culpeper County. The initial disbelief quickly gave way to horror, then to a desperate need for answers. The children, blinking in the unfamiliar sunlight, were carefully brought out of their underground confinement. Their condition was heartbreaking. They were severely malnourished, their skin pale and translucent from years without sunlight. Their eyes, accustomed to perpetual dimness, squinted painfully in the bright afternoon. Many showed signs of stunted growth, their bodies small and frail for their apparent ages. They were also profoundly silent, communicating mostly through gestures or soft, almost inaudible murmurs. Their language was rudimentary, their understanding of the outside world virtually non-existent. Medical professionals from Culper were immediately called to the Vance farm. Dr. Elias Thorne, the county physician, examined each child with a heavy heart. He confirmed their malnourishment and the severe lack of vitamin D which had weakened their bones. More disturbing was their psychological state. They exhibited extreme fear of open spaces, loud noises, and unfamiliar faces. They clung to each other, their only comfort found in the familiar presence of their fellow captives. Some of the younger children had never seen the sky, never felt grass beneath their feet, never heard the natural sounds of the world beyond the muffled echoes of their underground prison. The underground rooms themselves were a testament to Harlan Vance's chilling dedication. They were not merely a cellar, but an elaborate hand-dug system of living quarters, a subterranean world constructed over years of secret labor. There were separa, sleeping areas, a crude kitchen with a small wood-burning stove connected to a cleverly disguised chimney flue, and even a small dark space that appeared to be used for instruction. The tools found within, shovels, picks, buckets, and even a rudimentary pulley system, indicated the immense effort involved in their creation and maintenance. When confronted, Harlan Vance, now stripped of his bluster, offered a chilling justification for his actions. His voice, though subdued, still carried the cadence of a preacher, albeit one twisted by fanaticism. He spoke of the outside world as a cesspool of sin, a place of moral decay and spiritual corruption. He believed he was protecting these children, shielding them from the temptations and evils that would surely lead them to eternal damnation. He saw himself not as a captor, but as a savior, a shepherd guarding his flock from the wolves of the world. He claimed his actions were divinely inspired, a sacred duty to raise a generation of pure, unblemished souls, untainted by worldly influences. He had taught them scripture, he said, and the importance of obedience, silence, and hard work. He had made them labor in the underground chambers, digging, expanding, maintaining their hidden world, believing that honest toil was a path to spiritual purity. This was not just religious fanaticism. It was a profound, terrifying delusion, combined with a darker layer of control and exploitation. He had created his own kingdom, his own congregation, where he was the absolute authority, his word law, his will, unquestioned. The revelation of which children were not his own was perhaps the most disturbing aspect. Heron admitted with a chilling lack of remorse that some of the children were indeed his biological offspring with Dorcas, but others, he confessed, had been rescued from what he perceived as ungodly or neglectful homes. He had over the years sought out families in distress, often those with many children and few resources, offering to take in a child, promising them a better life, a spiritual upbringing. He had preyed on the vulnerable, on parents desperate enough to believe his promises, or perhaps too afraid to question his motives. Agnes Bellamy's son, Samuel, was among them. He was now 10 years old, a ghost of the vibrant boy she remembered, his eyes hollow, his spirit seemingly broken. There were other children, too, whose origins were slowly pieced together through painstaking investigation. Some were indeed from struggling families in neighboring counties, their disappearances previously attributed to runaway attempts or unfortunate accidents. Others were children of farm hands who had briefly worked for Vance, only to have their offspring vanish after a few weeks. Harlan had systematically, meticulously, and secretly acquired these children, bringing them into his underground world, severing their ties to their past, and reshaping them into his silent captive flock. The climax of the discovery was not just the physical unearthing of the children, but the horrifying realization of the depth of Harlan Vance's delusion, the calculated cruelty beneath his pious facade, and the sheer audacity of his years-long deception. It was a crime born not of sudden passion, but of a slow, insidious corruption of faith, a chilling testament to the darkness that could fester in the heart of a man hidden beneath the very ground he walked upon. The aftermath of the discovery at the Vance farm was a maelstrom that swept through Culpeper County and beyond. The story, once whispered in hushed tones, now exploded into public consciousness, carried by newspapers across Virginia, and even into the northern states. The sheer scale of the deception, the years of hidden confinement, and the tragic condition of the Chai elder and shocked a nation already grappling with its own moral complexities. Harlan Vance was immediately arrested and charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and child cruelty. His trial was a sensation, drawing crowds from all corners of the state. He remained unrepentant, even defiant in court, reiterating his belief that he had acted under divine guidance, saving the children from a corrupt world. His testimony, a chilling blend of scripture and self-justification, painted a portrait of a man utterly consumed by his own warped ideology. The jury, however, was unmoved by his religious fervor. The evidence of the children's suffering, their emaciated bodies, their profound silence, spoke louder than any sermon. Harlan Vance was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life imprisonment in the state penitentiary, a fate considered lenient by many who called for the gallows. He died in prison some years later, still convinced of his own righteousness. Dorcas Vance, his wife, was a more complex figure. She was also arrested, but her role was seen differently. Her testimony, delivered in a fragile, broken voice, revealed years of terror and coercion. She had been a prisoner herself, trapped by her husband's iron will and his escalating madness. She had been forced to assist in the care of the children, to prepare their meager meals, to maintain their hidden world, all while living under the constant threat of Harlan's wrath. The court, recognizing her own suffering and her clear mental distress, showed leniency. She was committed to a state asylum for a period of recovery and observation, eventually released into the care of distant relatives, a woman forever haunted by the horrors she had witnessed and been forced to endure. The children's fates were varied and often heartbreaking. The Vance biological children, those who could be identified, were placed with relatives or in orphanages. The rescued children, like Samuel Bellamy, were reunited with their families where possible. Agnes Bellamy, her face stray with tears, embraced her son, a reunion both joyous and profoundly sad. For the boy she held was not the same one she had lost. Many of the children, however, had no families to return to, or their families were unable or unwilling to take them back. They were placed in various orphanages and charitable institutions, their lives forever marked by their years underground. Their journey to recovery was long and arduous, a slow, painful process of learning to live in a world they barely knew, to trust, to speak, to simply be children. Many struggled with the psychological scars for the rest of their lives, forever carrying the weight of their stolen childhoods. The Vance farm, once a symbol of prosperity, became a place of infamy. The farmhouse was eventually torn down. The underground chambers filled in, buried beneath the earth once more, as if to erase the memory of the horrors they had contained. The land was sold, but for years no one wanted to live on it, the shadow of its past too heavy to bear. It eventually became, overgrown, a silent testament to the dark chapter it had witnessed. As we conclude this chilling account, we invite you to reflect on the enduring questions it raises. What hidden truths lie beneath the surface of our own communities? And how often do we, through silence or indifference, allow the shadows to deepen? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The story of the Vance family left an indelible mark on Culpeper County and on the collective conscience of Virginia. It led to calls for stricter oversight of child welfare, for greater community vigilance, and for a re-examination of the boundaries between private family matters and public responsibility. But for all the legal reforms and public outcry, question was never fully answered. A question that lingered like the oppressive summer heat over the fields of Culpeper. How many people knew, or at least suspected, and said nothing? How many had seen the signs, heard the whispers, felt the unease, and yet out of deference, out of fear, or simply out of a reluctance to interfere, had allowed Harlan Vance's dark secret to fester, hidden beneath the very ground they walked upon? For years, it was a question that haunted the county, a silent accusation against a community that had perhaps unwittingly allowed a profound evil to flourish in its midst.